This week, the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was on his honeymoon, of course, after his low-key wedding at the Lodge last weekend. But Senate estimates rolled on in Canberra and we did uncover some interesting secrets. Joining me to discuss is our Chief Political Correspondent Paul Sakkal and our Political Correspondent Natassia Chrysanthos, both beaming in live from Canberra.
Hey, Jack.
Hello.
Okay, so on this podcast, we've recently focused on the opposition a lot, and last week we interviewed opposition leader Susan Lee, and we've talked a lot about the coalition's internal implosion over its net zero policy. And we feel like, or I feel like we've maybe undercooked the government a little bit, or scrutiny on the government a little bit. So this week I want to correct that. To that end, the big story this week was the government's social media ban, which will come into effect next week on December 10, I believe. And Communications Minister Annika Wells, who is young and we're led to believe up-and-coming minister, gave a speech to the National Press Club about that ban. Natassia attended, and it was supposed to be sort of like a crowning achievement type speech, wasn't it? Because this social media ban has got bipartisan support. It's hugely popular amongst parents, maybe not so much amongst teens and tweens. But the whole speech kind of got hijacked by another issue. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, and in terms of the kind of scene setter, I think people criticise this government for a lack of ambition at times. The social media ban is probably one of the big policies it would point to as a sign of its appetite for bold reform. So there's a lot resting on it. Annika Wells inherited this big policy after the election, and so the speech this week was a bit of a kind of, I guess, laying the groundwork for that, but also tempering expectations, I think, for what people should expect
Hugely.
Next week. At the same time, you have a story break the previous night around Senate estimates that looks at the travel expense of Minister Wells and her staff member to go to the United Nations in September this year.
Taxpayers coughed up almost $100,000 for flights so the Communications Minister and her staff could spruik Australia's world-first social media ban in New York.
And according to this document, the flights for Wells cost about $34,000 return, and for her staff member cost about $38,000 return. So there was a big please explain over that.
Well, according to our story, it was nearly $100,000 on flights for the three of them. So Minister Wells and then two
another
staffers, basically, which is an extraordinary amount of money. And I actually struggled to understand how any flight can cost $30,000, but apparently they did.
They haven't really explained how.
No. And as you say, this was to the UN General Assembly, and they got really good publicity out of it at the time because it was this world-leading thing. And I think the president of the EU showed up to this event, and it got really good coverage. I think not just in Australia, but also a little bit globally because it's a world-leading ban, as they keep saying. And now we're finding out that the cost was just astronomical. It always amazes me when this stuff comes up because so many politicians have fallen on their sword over it, and it's something that's really it's a really easy reference point for voters because they know, like, hang on, how can a flight cost $30,000? Or Susan Lee got done for this when, in 2017 when she was found to have taken a taxpayer-funded flight to the Gold Coast to buy an apartment privately.
And I think this one is like, it was strictly government business. They have an argument for why it was important. So I think perhaps they knew how much the flight cost. They had a night's preparation that this story was going to come out. There could have perhaps been a slightly more robust defence of that.
I was actually really intrigued to know how one single flight could cost $30,000 or in excess of $30,000. Having, I'm more of a kind of bogan missile type flyer, like I'm Jetstar or bust.
I'm the same, actually. Love a Jetstar.
Yeah, actually, shout out to Jetstar.
I think everyone was very intrigued when the office by like 8 a.m. was Googling how much it would cost to fly first class Qantas to New York the next day.
Yes.
And that came up at $16,000 return.
So we're talking double
but
that.
Now,
and this was $38,000.
But it was $38,000 return. I was talking to a government staffer about it, and they were kind of saying, flights do fluctuate wildly, especially the business class prices for these big global summits and events.
Right.
Because the airlines are aware, and especially, I think it was maybe New York Fashion Week around that time as well, and it was the UN, and there are a couple of things on. And
she had to delay a flight right till the last moment because she was dealing with the Optus trip.
Look, it's a matter of public record that I delayed my departure because of the Optus outages.
Good evening. The scale of the tragedy linked to Thursday's Optus outage is becoming clearer tonight. In the last hour, the death of a fourth person has been confirmed by the West Australian Premier, a 49-year-old man from Perth.
But the Prime Minister was questioning whether she should go,
she
and
was
he
supposed
gave
to go on
final
the Prime Minister's
Oh,
plane,
of
then
course.
she couldn't end up going on the Prime Minister's plane, so
Well,
it was a
38 is
very
still
last
kinda
minute.
crazy.
Yes, and I think what... Yeah.
Sorry, I just love the idea of all the journalists going, what? What does a business class flight even cost? And what does a first class flight even
And I
cost?
think
It's beyond our wildest
everyone was
imaginings.
also like, first class flight tomorrow, only $16,000. Worth it? I don't know.
Want to jump on?
Maybe. But what was interesting, I think, then in her because it's more just like I think the reason it became a story was that it didn't make clear sense.
No.
When you kind of benchmark typical flight prices, and so I think it was an interesting decision that. Given there was then so much speculation, for example, like, was it a first-class flight? Because that tends to be kind of toward the higher end of first-class flights, those prices. Was it a charter flight? Like, there are all these questions. But at the press club, she was asked, why did they cost so much? Then she was asked again, can you just explain the cost? Were they first-class flights, for example? She said, no, they weren't. So then that leaves an assumption they're business class flights, in which case they're very expensive business class flights.
Yep.
She was then thrown a bone, I think, by the host of the press club who said,
Yep.
well, was it because it was such a last minute flight that it just cost that much? And again, she didn't really say.
Could you explain perhaps why those flights cost upward of $34,000, for example, were they first class flights? And given the government's kind of sensitivity to cost of living issues, do you think it passes the pub test?
No, they weren't first-class flights. We will disclose further through the usual IPIA processes that haven't rolled out yet. The reason you have this information now is because it was a question on notice that we've provided ahead of the Senate estimates process. All absolutely usual, and we'll continue to comply with all of the usual rules. I would refer you back to the fact that this is about one of the most important public policy challenges of our time. The event.
I think that those numbers, I'm probably making some leaps here, but I feel like the average voter would understand a minister on a really long haul flight taking a business or first class tickets within the guidelines.
Yeah.
They're looking at sensitive documents. They need to be fresh immediately when they land to go to their events and deal with dignitaries, and then they're on a different time zone and they pretty much stay up all day on when they're back on their previous sleep cycle. But I think it was the numbers that just leapt out and looked absurd. Like a $38,000 flight strikes you as ridiculous. And her reluctance to explain why it was so high, which might have a decent explanation, just furthers the narrative. And there's a lot of the commentary in the last day has been along the lines of this looking on the nose in a cost of living crisis. I mean, I think it would be on the nose. We live in a period of very high distrust of government. Yes, some people are doing it tough, but even people who are not would look at this and just think, oh, really? And I think the instinct of voters these days is to immediately look for a reason why this casts the political classes out of touch and corrupt. That's where most voters' minds go, cost of living crisis or otherwise. And I think if the government was just front-footed on this and said why her trip was important, why it cost so much, they'd probably do a better job of winning the argument.
Yeah. Paul, the story came out sort of through the estimates process, didn't it? So when Annika Wells talks about transparency and sort of makes a virtue of the transparency, was actually, I think, opposition questions on notice that they had to answer basically, and then they slipped out very late or sort of reasonably late on Tuesday night. Is that right?
I think it came out through a Senate question.
Yeah, but I
on
think
notice.
it is
Was it through the
disclosed
estimates process?
ultimately through finance.
But was it Finance's decision to put it out at that time, or is that when the
I think
opposition
they
learnt
generally
about
have to publish answers to quants before the next estimates hearing.
Okay. So it needs to get published before Finance rocks up in Senate estimates. Yeah, so that's right.
Generally.
Yeah. So, I mean, our story says that the government replied to an opposition question on notice from Senate estimates in October. So, I guess it's a month or two old, this question. And they've slipped it out on Tuesday, late on Tuesday, which is, standard operating procedure, I suppose, for most governments who want to downplay something. let's talk about the actual social media ban. Paul, do you think there's a risk here for the government? It's such a popular policy amongst parents like myself, who have such huge anxiety over what social media is doing to their kids. What do you think the risks are? Why do you think there are even risks in it?
Well, I think this little blow up over the expenses helps bring to light this interesting paradox on this policy debate. In one sense, the government's taken a huge step forward here. They're a world leader in this space. Annika Wells was in the UN General Assembly speaking at a conference alongside Ursula von der Leyen, the EU president, as you say. There's global momentum around what Australia's doing. We look like the outlier nation that's willing to take on the tech giants and do a reform that, as you say, Jack, parents love. So we're getting a lot of kudos internationally. Annika Wells did an interview with the BBC the other night. But in Australia, in particular in the press gallery reporting on this reform, there is a tendency to needle in on the flaws, the messiness of how it's been put together, this sense that only a week out we're still adding social media platforms to the ban. You're seeing the bipartisanship on the coalition side, and they were actually the party that first proposed this, start to break away. They're questioning whether it will work. They're saying that parents are worried about data retention on the part of the tech giants. You're seeing Teal MPs like Monique Ryan, who support the essence of the ban, say, I don't think this is going to work. And so you've got, on the one hand, the government saying this is a momentous reform, and it is in some ways, but there's this other part of the debate about how it will work. And over summer, as kids get bored during the school holiday period, if there is a growing view that kids are just getting around this through VPNs or using different apps like Yope or Lemonade. I didn't know what those words meant in an app sense until a week ago. Then you could see a growing narrative that this reform, while worthy, is not practical.
Yeah, or just that the government's done not a very good job at implementing it. So it then becomes, I agree, like we don't know how it's going to work. It seems very audacious and brave, actually, and I think most people would agree that it's a good thing to try. Whether or not they get points for trying if and when it sort of falls apart, and like tweens and teens around the nation are way savvier than the adults who are trying to police them in getting around this stuff. It could become sort of a competency issue for the Albanese government, that they're not particularly good at getting stuff done, particularly complex policy reform like this. I mean, it'll be really interesting one to watch because, as I say, I do think it's enormously popular, and it's a real winner, and you sort of, you can't really go wrong when you're standing up to big tech giants who are so on the nose internationally at the moment in terms of their behaviour. And also it's protecting children, and people always want to do that.
Like at the end of the day, and I think this is a point that Wells kind of fairly made yesterday as well, this is about kind of long-term behavioural change.
Yeah.
Sending a signal.
Yeah. And it's like, even if the kind of tech element is like half or 2/3 effective at getting kids off the apps, kind of what the intent is that you change the kind of social norms or behaviours or expectations of that age group over time. And so they've got a 2-year review, I think, like an expert review of Australian academics and overseas academics monitoring it, and it'll probably take at least that long before we can actually tell.
And she's kind of at pains to point out over and over. It's almost the first thing she says when asked on this topic is that kids might find a way around it. Some 16-year-olds still get booze even though they're not legally permitted to.
Yes.
And she's finding new points to emphasise about how kids can get around it. Like she said the other day that you can get your 17-year-old brother to log you into Instagram. Yeah. So it's one of the only policy proposals I've seen put forward where the government is trying to emphasise the downside risk to manage expectations. And I think
the really tricky part of this is for that current 13 to 16-year-old age group, you're turning the tap off. So this is the real troublesome point. Yeah. Whereas kind of eventually the whole point is you're not turning the tap on for 13-year-olds for a few years. So I think it's going to be hardest for this group of kids, and that's also why it's going to there's going to be a lot of evasion or whatever.
They're like the existing smokers.
Yeah,
who
yeah,
you're
yeah,
jacking the
exactly.
price of darts
Yeah,
up.
it's not the kind of policy you can grandfather. So there'll be 13-year-olds or sort of 15-year-olds will be turned off this week and be able to go back on next week when they turn 16. It's imperfect in that sense, but I mean, I've got a tween, and it's just an easy way. It's actually quite a good way to open up a conversation about all this stuff. They hear it on the news, and you can say there's a lot of talk now about why adults, why this stuff maybe isn't so good for children. Social media can be harmful for them. It's all about protecting your brain, that kind of stuff. So I do think it's really popular, but it's going to be really, really interesting to see how it's implemented, and if it's messy, it might end up going to the government's competence. As I said before, as we talked about before, it was Senate estimates this week, but Paul, it wasn't supposed to be Senate estimates. So the Senate estimates week was sort of forced upon them all by Independent Senator David Pocock. How did that happen?
Yeah, so this wasn't booked in this final week of Senate estimates. So Senate estimates means that the senators are here, grilling bureaucrats, all the members of the House of Representatives, 151 or however many it is, are back in the electorate. It's only the 76 senators. David Pocock's the ACT independent senator, big on transparency, big on government accountability. He had been pushing Labor to release this report called the Briggs Report, which they'd been sitting on for, I think, more than a year, commissioned by Labor. 2 years, Natassia says. 2 years, commissioned by Labor after long-running debate about the Morrison government stacking boards and other organisations with political appointments. Labor had commissioned the review, had its recommendations on the ministerial desk, and spent a long time agonising over what to do because they also make some political appointments. And David Pocock thought this was a disgrace and effectively teamed up with the coalition to penalise Labor for not releasing this report, and part of that penalty was to add an additional week of estimates on. So Penny Wong and Katie Gallagher, the Labor leaders in the Senate, have been complaining privately to coalition MPs this week saying, we didn't want to be here, you don't want to be here either, why are you working with Pocock? We had the Prime Minister's wedding on Saturday and all we had to do was prepare for estimates. So there's lots of grumbling across Canberra. The coalition people are flat as a tack, don't really want to be here. Labor ministers don't want to be defending these questions, but here we all are.
I think, though, that also just like as a throw forward to next year, this kind of emerging alliance on certain things between Coalition Greens and Pocock, it's kind of like an unholy trinity of independent, centre-right opposition and left
and
opposition. And they are finding points. They're finding points to corral together, and it really annoys the government.
It's the beauty of the bicameral system that governments almost never control the Senate, so it's a real wild card, and it always annoys the hell out of them. The report that all of this was sort of the fight that all of this was about was this report, Tasha, very sort of bold and dynamic title, I thought, called No Favourites. And as you say, it was commissioned in 2023. It was basically about government board appointments. So, there's all of these government boards. Like I was having a look at them. There's so many of them, like Air Services Australia Board, the Australia Post Board, Australian Building Codes Board, things in more high profile things like the Board of the ABC. And they all need people, highly qualified, one hopes, meritocratic appointments to these boards. But governments often have been known to just appoint their mates, or people who are former politicians, or people who've been good to the party in whatever way. The Morrison government was notorious for it. So, and particularly with the the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, which is a very important. It's not actually a government board. It's a very important, legal institution basically that oversees and scrutinises government decisions, and they were absolute bandits for political appointments to the AAT, so much so that the Labor opposition actually made a big thing of it and ended up abolishing the AAT and replacing it with the ART. So that's sort of the background, right? So they've made a big deal about this in opposition, and then they've come into government, commissioned a report about it, and then they've sat on the report for a long time. Paul, why would they do that, and what did the report sort of find?
The report recommended stripping a lot of power from the government to make political appointments, not allowing them to make them within 6 months of an election, because that's seen as a period where you can make some contentious calls just before you might lose power. And effectively, without going into too much detail on the recommendations, they recommended a total overhaul of how appointments work to make it much harder for government to put in friends of a political party or former MPs or former staff into bodies. Labor wanted to do some of it, but not all, because they think there's a balance to be struck here. They do want to appoint Kevin Rudd to be an ambassador. They do want to appoint Kim Beazley to be the War Memorial director or chairman or whatever he is. But they do think there's a problem that needs to be solved. And this is a similar kind of dynamic you see play out with Labor on a bunch of different transparency issues now, where they came into power wanting to reverse course on the Morrison era, which was seen to be, a degradation of how good government operates, maybe played up and exaggerated by Labor. And then on the Labor's left flank now, particularly with David Pocock, who's becoming a real figure of annoyance for Labor, he can always outflank them on the transparency side. And he's expert at using social media and all bunch of and traditional media to portray Labor as not interested in integrity. And on this issue, Labor needs to find a middle path through where they can continue to make politically expedient decisions, but also appear to be more kind of less corrupt than previous governments. But they've got David Pocock making them appear, not quite pure enough.
Yeah, it's interesting sort of turning of the tables because. And I mean, I think it's called grey corruption. So it's not like sort of, cash piles of cash in brown paper bag type corruption, but it is the sort of, as you say, the rewarding of friends with appointments that are often very, very well remunerated. Like we're talking sort of salaries in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, it over time, as the report sort of makes clear, erodes public trust in institutions. It further erodes public trust in politicians because voters get the sense that politicians are only in it for themselves and maybe to enrich or help their mates. So it is an issue, and I think I personally think it was a major issue along with sports frauds for painting this picture of the Morrison government as being. Very self-interested and interested in themselves above and beyond the interests of the Australian people.
And Morrison with the AAT, like the Liberal Party, like to be blunt, they started to take the piss with the AAT.
Oh,
there were 85. Yeah. I think it's 85 MPs, staffers, or former party associates. But
as
that's Labor,
those jobs. I mean, you require solid legal minds to do those jobs. They're not it's actually a very important arm of government, the AAT, the old AAT. That was actually quite egregious. But I remember the Labor opposition, Tony Burke at the time, they were so onto it. They were really upset about it. They made a big deal of it, and to their credit, they actually sort of got a little bit of sort of public. They got a little bit of publicity over it, even though it was a pretty dry area of administrative sort of law. And now they're being scrutinised, and it's not so fun on the other side.
Yeah, and Labor knows that, say, for example, the Australia Post Board or any bunch of these kinds of important agencies, Labor knows that some of their former MPs and party officials have the kind of executive authority and political go-getter mindset to play important roles in some of these bodies. So it's not that easy to find a bureaucrat with no link to a political party to go and do these roles.
Yeah.
People who have been involved in politics or had a role for a period in a ministerial office are often the best suited person for a job. Yeah. So Labor's trying to strike that balance, and we probably don't help in the media where we scrutinise every single one of these decisions as if they are grey corruption, when sometimes
I would disagree on that, because I think what the report says is not don't make political appointments, because former politicians have skills. They know how government works. They have personal relationships. They have a lot of knowledge and experience to bring to the kinds of things they need for a government board role. But I think the report just says that's fine, but they need to go through a process. Like, they need to apply for it like everybody else does, which is perhaps is not always convenient if you're a government minister and you just need someone to be appointed straight away, and it's just easy to pop them in there. But I guess you've got to balance that against the public trust issue. Very interesting stuff. We know also Albanese has been on his honeymoon this week. Any ideas where he's been on his honeymoon, guys?
In Australia is all we know, not Hawaii.
Okay. And maybe he paid for his own flights, I'm sure.
They were papped at the airport with the punters.
Okay.
In the Sydney International Terminal, domestic terminal, surely, of course.
Terminal,
okay,
please.
So what did they sit down? Did they sit down in the general area and read the paper and have a coffee with the hoi polloi?
He
or were they in
he
the
was
Qantas
holding
lounge?
both the bags.
Oh, gentleman.
So no bag
What a
carrier.
man.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, we wish
done,
them well.
Jodie.
I think
Just two normal people on a honeymoon over December.
Annika Wells could take some pointers on how to do air travel the right way.
good luck to them. I think the Anthony Albanese and Jodie Hayden are back this weekend, and I'm sure the Prime Minister will be on deck for work next week. I think.
I think so. They got away with that
He's
wedding
made
really
a
well. No political.
Yeah, actually, as I said to you
Outside of
earlier
it.
this week, Paul, I think it was a masterclass in media management. I think they did whoever was organising the media within the PMO for that wedding, full marks.
Well,
to you.
it was pretty forceful media management, and
Yes.
there was a whole lot of security department enforced secrecy around it.
Yeah, it was strictly
Did we talk about this
embargoed,
last week?
basically. We a lot of people
Strictly
knew about it.
embargoed, and yet so much gossip.
Yeah,
Like
so,
all the leaks were coming from from outside of this building.
yes.
I do find it a bit
Which was
uncomfortable
very
when the
funny.
whole press gallery agrees to keep a really interesting and important piece of information from the public, but security advice is security advice. We shouldn't question it, and we do live in a period of really heightened security risk for politicians. But there was a sense across the gallery, I think, of slight unease about playing into the government's hands on keeping this wedding quiet when we knew that the Prime Minister and the people around him delayed this until after the election because of the political risk. They were really keen to avoid speculation about who would be invited. They didn't send out written invites. They couldn't be leaked. And the Prime Minister timed it to be directly after a sitting week so that there would be no gap from the press gallery's attention being focused on Parliament to focus on the wedding and the invite list. So the secrecy was there for a reason, but it also benefited the government, and that is a bit uncomfortable for me.
Yes.
But I'm very happy for them. To be clear,
it's a
extremely
private
happy.
event. It's a private event. I don't.
He's the Prime Minister, though.
Yeah, but he's allowed to get married, isn't he? I don't know.
He is, and of course, it was a beautiful wedding, and they got a lot of positive feedback from the community, which is great. But not being able to say it was happening when everybody knew it was happening until we get government released photographs at 5 p.m. is not generally the way media reporting works.
No, it was uncomfortable for us last week. I felt that discomfort as well. And these are the accommodations that we make sometimes. But it's difficult to know that you're sort of withholding something from readers or from listeners. Guys, thanks so much. That was fun as always, and I'll see you next week.
Talk to you next week.
Bye.